"Step back from the caisson, ma'am. This isn't a viewing area." The voice came from a man who had spent 9 years learning to make people move. Sergeant First Class Dane Corliss stood at the edge of the cordon in the cold October light, one arm out, herding the crowd the way he always did, by controlling everything within reach of his hand. Behind him, 6 black horses stood in their traces, a caisson, a flag over a casket. The whole grave machinery of Arlington National Cemetery, laid out clean across the hill above the river. The woman he was talking to wore a plain wool coat. Gray. Off the rack. No rank. No ribbon. Nothing that would make a man look twice. A gloved fist held something small at her side, and her hair was pulled back tight and plain, and she was the kind of unremarkable that a cordon sergeant sorts and forgets in the same second. She stepped back. 1 pace. Exact. The pace of someone who had measured that distance 10,000 times. Corliss did not notice the exactness. He noticed only that she had been a half-step too close, and that half-step, on his cordon, on his morning, was a problem he had already solved. He turned back to the line and forgot her. 9 years the old guard had made a certain kind of man out of Dane Corliss. A good kind, mostly. He kept the route clean. He kept the families safe from the tourists, and the tourists safe from themselves. And he had folded more flags into more shaking hands than he could count. And he believed, with the flat, total belief of a man who has never once been proven wrong in public, that his eye for a crowd was the sharpest thing he owned. He looked at 100 people on a cold morning and knew, in a heartbeat, which ones would give him trouble. He had already decided the woman in the gray coat was not one of them. Just a straggler. Just someone who'd wandered a step too far, chasing a photograph she'd never take. He was about to spend the next 40 minutes being wrong about her, and he would not understand how wrong until the horses told him. The morning was the kind Arlington kept for its best work. Clear. Cold enough to see breath. The stones ran down the slope in white rows to the water, and the light came in low and folded over the caisson, like something that knew what it was for. There were families along the tape, a scatter of uniforms, a boy of about 7 in a clip-on tie, holding his mother's hand, watching the horses with his whole face. The woman in the wool coat watched the casket. She did not film it. She did not lift a phone. Her eyes tracked the flag and did not let it go, and the small, worn thing in her gloved hand turned once, slowly, against her palm. There is a way the grieving stand at Arlington, and there is a way soldiers stand, and the two are not the same. The grieving hold their bodies like something borrowed, shoulders up around the ears, hands not knowing where to be, the whole frame braced against a weight it was never trained to carry. The woman in the gray coat did not stand like that. She stood the way a blade rests in a sheath, still, ready. Weight even on both feet, spine long, hands quiet, breathing slow and deep and controlled, as if she had learned a long time ago that the only way through a thing this heavy was to carry it the way you carry everything. One measured breath at a time, giving nothing away to the cold, or the crowd, or the man who kept telling her to move. Corliss came back down the line and found her still there, still that half-step forward, and this time it annoyed him. All the way back behind the line, he said, "Let the family through." He put a hand on her arm. Not hard. A steer. The kind of grip a man uses when he has decided a woman is a piece of the crowd to be arranged. She did not flinch. She let him move her. Her eyes never left the caisson, and when his hand came off her arm, she stood exactly where he had put her, no farther, and came to attention. Heels together. Chin level. A stillness the crowd around her did not have and could not fake. 20 feet up the route, Command Sergeant Major Orrin Pratt stopped walking. Pratt had run this cordon 400 times if he had run it once. He knew the shape of a crowd. He knew the fidget of civilians, the phone lift, the lean, the way people at a funeral shifted their weight because their bodies did not know what to do with the size of the thing in front of them. He knew all of that in his sleep. He did not know this. A woman in a wool coat, no rank on her anywhere, standing like a soldier stands a post nobody assigned her. He filed it, and he kept it, and he began, very slowly, to watch. The section chief called the Caisson to step off. The command left his mouth as a single flat syllable, and the horses leaned into the traces, and the whole procession began to move down the hill toward the gravesite. The woman in the wool coat was already still before the horses moved. That was the thing Pratt caught and could not put down. She read the geometry of it a beat before it happened. 6 horses, 3 mounted riders, 1 casket, and her body settled into the rhythm of the section, like water finding a level it already knew. He watched her anticipate the halt. That was the second thing. Before the section chief's voice ever crossed the cold air, before the command left him, her weight shifted, a fraction, a hair, the smallest correction, into the stop that was coming, so that when the horses checked and the caisson stilled, she was already there, already square, already waiting for a thing the rest of the crowd was still a full beat behind on. You could not fake that. You could not learn it from a documentary or a book or a single visit to a grave. It came from having stood the route yourself, from having walked those 6 horses down this exact hill enough times that the cadence of it lived under your skin, from a body that had been taught the rhythm of the dead so long ago it no longer needed to think. Pratt had that rhythm in him too. That was how he recognized it. It takes one to know one, the old soldiers said, and standing on that hillside, he knew exactly what he was looking at, and could not for his life have told you her name. The boy in the clip-on tie tugged his mother's sleeve and pointed at the last horse, the one with no rider, the one with a saddle and stirrups and no man in them, and the boots turned backward in the stirrups, heels forward, toes to the tail. "Why's that horse empty?" the boy asked. To no one, to the air. The woman answered him, quiet, not turning her head. "The boots face backward," she said. "It means the rider has taken his last look at his men." The boy stared at her. She did not explain further. She did not need to. She had said it the way you say a thing you have known so long it has stopped being information and become bone. "Did you know him?" the boy asked. "The person in the box?" For a moment she did not answer. The flag moved past on its dark carriage, and the horse's hooves came down soft on the road, and the small, worn thing turned once more in her glove. "He knew me," she said, "before anybody else did." The boy did not understand that, the way a boy of 7 cannot yet understand, that the most important person in a life is sometimes the one who saw you when you were nothing and refused to look away. But he heard the weight in it. He went quiet, and he held his mother's hand, and he stood a little straighter beside the still woman in the gray coat. And for a moment, the 3 of them, the boy, the mother, and the colonel, nobody could see, watched a general go by together. Corliss, working back up the line, heard her talking, and read it as more crowding, more of the same problem, and told her again to keep the space clear. She had not moved. There was no space to clear, but Corliss had decided what she was, and a man who has decided what you are will keep finding evidence for it in an empty field. Pratt watched Corliss correct a woman who was doing nothing wrong, and his jaw set, and still he said nothing, because the family was coming, and the section was moving, and a sergeant major does not stop a general's funeral to teach a sergeant to see. But he watched her salute. The caisson drew level. She brought her right hand up. Slow, controlled, the blade of it flat, the angle textbook, the whole arm carved from the same stillness as the rest of her, and held it. held it while the horses passed, held it without a tremor, without a shift, without the small human failures that live in every held salute. And Pratt saw the watch on her wrist, worn face inward, the way a person wears it who has spent years not wanting light off the crystal to give her away. A spectator does not wear a watch like that. A spectator does not hold a salute like that. A spectator does not know what backward boots mean before a child can ask. Pratt had run this cordon 400 times. He had never once seen a woman in the crowd stand a post. He started quietly to close the distance. Corliss got there first, and Corliss escalated. He had decided the woman was a problem to be managed, and now he made a small show of managing her, loud enough that the nearest families turned, pitched to Carrie, the voice of a man performing his authority for an audience. "Some folks treat this like a parade," he said. "It isn't. Behind the line, ma'am. I won't ask again." Heads turned. The mother pulled the boy a step away, uncertain now, the way people get uncertain when someone in a uniform decides someone near them is trouble. That is the quiet violence of a little authority. It does not need to be right to be believed. A man in the right uniform points at a woman and calls her a spectacle chaser, and the crowd rearranges itself around the accusation without ever asking whether it's true. Two women near the tape exchanged a look. A man tightened his grip on his coat. The story Corliss was telling, that the woman in the gray coat did not belong this close to a soldier's grief, spread through the nearby crowd faster than any correction ever could because it cost nothing to believe, and everyone was already cold and looking for somewhere to put their discomfort. She felt it settle on her. She had felt worse settle on her in worse places. She did not so much as change the set of her shoulders. Specialist Milo Trask, 20 years old, 3 months on the cordon, stood at Corliss's shoulder and winced. He had watched the whole thing. He had watched the woman step back every time she was asked, and stand quiet every time she was pushed, and something in the way she took, it made him feel that the wrongness in this exchange was not hers. He waited until Corliss moved off. Then he stepped over to her and dropped his voice and offered her the only thing he had to give. "You can stand here, ma'am," Trask said, nodding at a spot with a clear line to the route. "Nobody'll bother you." She looked at him, really looked, for the first time all morning, a fast, complete read that went over him once and filed everything. Then she thanked him with a single nod. "Appreciate it," she said. Trask went back to his post and could not have told you why his neck felt hot. Only that the woman had thanked him the way a person thanks you when they have been thanked by far more important people for far more important things, and had not forgotten how to mean it small. He was 20 years old. He had joined the old guard because his grandfather had been buried out of it, and he had wanted, in some way he could not put into words, to be one of the men who did that work, the folding, the carrying, the standing of the line. 3 months in, he had already learned that most of the job was crowd control and cold feet, and he had already started, a little, to let the wonder of it go gray. But something about the woman in the gray coat had put a hand on that grayness and pushed it back. He did not know what. He only knew that Corliss had looked at her and seen a problem, and that he had looked at her and seen something he wanted to be closer to, and that the difference between those two ways of looking was, he suspected, the difference between the kind of soldier he was and the kind he wanted to become. She stood where he'd put her. The worn thing turned once in her glove. She did not correct Corliss. She did not lift her chin and give him a rank. She did not reach into the wool coat and produce the card that would have ended his morning in one sentence. She had not come to Arlington to win a cordon line. She had come to bury the man who had bet on her when she was worth nothing, and she was not going to spend 1 ounce of him on a sergeant who couldn't see. Pratt saw all of it. The performance, the wince on the young specialist, the woman taking it and giving back nothing but stillness. He filed that too, and his jaw stayed set. And he decided, the way old soldiers decide things without visible motion, that he was done watching. There is a certain kind of person who will stand quiet while she is pushed to the back of a soldier's funeral, asking nothing, defending nothing, because the day is not about her, and she knows it. That kind of person is almost always the last person on the field you should have put your hands on. If that lands for you, take 1 second and subscribe to Honor Tales, because you have not yet seen what she stood quiet through, or what stood quiet with her. The procession bent toward the columbarium road and the gravesite beyond, and the woman in the wool coat drifted with it, not forward, not into anyone, just enough to keep the caisson in her sight, to keep the flag in her eyes, to not lose the casket in the crowd. Corliss read it as defiance. "I've got a civilian who won't hold the line," he said into his radio. Flat. Official. A man building a case. "Let's walk her back to the visitor area." He waved over a cemetery representative with a clipboard and another old guard soldier, and the three of them converged on her the way a system converges on a thing it has labeled, not with cruelty, exactly, but with the awful patience of process. The escort asked her, not unkindly, to come away from the route. And here the woman spoke more than she had all morning, because here they were trying to take from her the one part of the morning that mattered, and she answered them in the language of the ground itself. "I'll stand where the mourners stand," she said. "I know where that is." She did know. She named it. She told the cemetery representative exactly where the cordon ended and where the family space began, and where a person who had come to render honors was permitted to stand, and she cited it clean, in the section's own words, without heat. The representative blinked at his clipboard. He had not expected the wording. He had expected a civilian who did not know the rules, and instead he had a woman who knew them better than he did, reciting the boundary between mourner and family space, like a line she had walked in her sleep. It did not change what he wrote. That was the thing about the machinery. It did not care what she knew. It cared only that a man in a uniform had flagged her, and a flag, once raised, has its own gravity. "She's not being aggressive," the escort said, low, to the representative. "She's just—" "She won't stay back," Corliss said, over both of them, closing it. "That's all that needs to go in the log." And so it went in the log. The escort keyed his radio, and in the small machinery of that road, a colonel of the United States Army became a line item. The civilian who won't cooperate. A managed disturbance, a note in a book, at the funeral of the one man who had ever looked at the worst year of her life and decided it was not the end of her. She stood inside the machinery and let it label her, and she did not spend a word to stop it, because the words she had left, she was saving for the grave. The caisson halted at the head of the graveside road, and the woman they were walking backward came to attention again. Right there, mid-herd, with a hand at her elbow and a radio at her ear, she squared her heels and brought her salute up and held it, unmoving, while the people around her fidgeted and filmed and did not understand what they were looking at. On every clipboard and every radio on that road, she was a problem to be moved. She had not raised her voice once. Pratt reached them before they reached the visitor area. He came down the route without hurry and without noise, the way senior men move when the field already belongs to them, and he put himself between the woman and the escort, and sent the escort back with a look that did not require words. Then he stood beside her, and he tested her, the way one old caisson soldier tests another. "You've stood a caisson route before," Pratt said. "A long time ago," she said. He gave her a door with a lock on it, a plain question, the kind only a section soldier could answer cleanly. 6 horses, he said. Only 3 riders. Why do we mount the near side and not the off? It was a soldier's trick of a question. The kind of thing you could not answer from a book, because the answer lived in the work, and the reason the Caisson platoon had ridden that way, since the days when the offside horses carried the feed and the gear, and a rider would have been a burden the mission could not spare. A tourist would guess. A historian might know the fact. Only someone who had done it would answer it the way she answered it. Because the off-horses used to carry the load, she said. You don't put weight where the work already is. The tradition outlived the wagons, but the reason didn't. We kept it because the horses learned it, and the horses don't read the new manuals. Pratt said nothing. She wasn't finished. She added a thing he had not asked, a small, plain truth about the care of the animals that no spectator on earth would know, a habit from the barn about how you settle a nervous horse on a cold route, about the sound you make and the hand you keep flat and low, and the reason you never let him feel you hurry. It was the kind of knowledge that lived below the level of anything printed anywhere. It was the kind of thing you only knew if you had stood in a dark stall at 4 a.m. and taught a frightened animal to trust you. Pratt was quiet for a moment. He had run this cordon 400 times. He had just handed a woman in a wool coat a lock, and she had walked through the door like she had built it. He clocked the rest of it now, the watch worn inward, the bearing that had never once broken, the fact that she had been rendering honors from the exact correct ground the entire morning, while a sergeant herded her like a tourist. He understood all at once that he had spent 40 minutes letting a soldier be pushed around his own funeral detail. He found Corliss off to the side and put it plainly, low, final. You'll leave that woman exactly where she is, Pratt said. That's not a request, Sergeant. You render her every courtesy this section owns, and you do not put your hand on her again. Corliss bristled. He was certain of his own. Read the way small authority is always most certain right before it learned something. She was a civilian. This was his cordon. He did not understand why the senior enlisted man of the entire regiment was spending capital on a woman in a wool coat, and he said as much, quietly, with the particular offense of a man who thinks the rules are being bent against him. Pratt did not argue. Pratt did not explain. Pratt was not entirely sure himself yet, only that she was one of theirs, and that was enough to spend anything on. Do what I told you, he said, and walked back to the route and opened a clear lane toward the section for a woman he could not yet name. He still did not know the half of it. The senior man on that field had just spent his authority to protect a soldier he could not name, on instinct alone, on the shape of a salute and the angle of a watch. And the half he could not see was the half that would stop the horses. If you want to see what the sergeant major couldn't, subscribe to Honor Tales, because it is coming down the hill right now. Pull back, for a moment, from the cordon and the cold. The audience should know what the field did not. 28 years earlier, in the winter of 1998, an 18-year-old named Eleanor Ashford had stood in the Fort Myers stables with a muck rake in her hands and nowhere else on earth to go. She had come to the Army because the Army had been the only door that opened, and she had come to the horses because the platoon put the angriest kids with the animals and let the animals do the work that people couldn't. There was a horse that winter that everyone had given up on. A hard, frightened, unrideable thing that had already put 2 soldiers on the ground. Ashford had worked him at 4 o'clock in the morning, alone, because the schedule said the horse was finished, and she was the only one who wouldn't sign the paper. A colonel found her there. Colonel Calvin Rourke, who commanded the regiment and made a habit of walking his own stables before dawn, found a furious teenager refusing to quit on a horse the whole platoon had condemned. He did not announce himself. He leaned on the stall rail in the dark and watched her work, watched her hold her hand flat and low and keep her voice under the horse's fear, watched her fail and start again, and fail and start again. And he saw in it something the paperwork on her had missed entirely. The paperwork said Private Ashford was a discipline problem, a hard case, a kid one bad week from being someone else's problem. The paperwork was not wrong, exactly. It was just looking at the wrong thing. Most people quit on the difficult ones, Rourke said, out of the dark, and the girl nearly came out of her skin. Saves them the trouble of finding out what the difficult ones can do. She did not have an answer for that. She was 18 and furious, and had never once in her life been caught being good at something. He did not tell her she was special. He told her she was not allowed to waste it. Rourke started the long work that morning, the work of making Eleanor Ashford into more than the worst year of her life. He pushed her toward a commission she did not believe she deserved. He wrote the letters. He made the calls. He kept, across 2 decades and a dozen assignments, a quiet weather eye on the angry kid from the barn, and he watched her become a soldier, and then an officer, and then something the paperwork could not quite describe, with a call sign, Vesper, and a command that lived behind locked doors. And then came the year that nearly finished the work for good. In 2019, a night operation went wrong in the way that nights go wrong, fast, and then all at once. There had been a doorway. There is always a doorway. Sergeant First Class Caleb Dorn had been beside her on the stack, a big steady man with 2 kids, and a habit of humming under his breath before a hit. And when the doorway turned into the worst place in the world, Caleb Dorn stepped into it so that the rest of them could step out. 3 seconds. He filled the doorway with himself for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, 4 people lived who would not otherwise have lived, and one of them was Eleanor Ashford, and Caleb Dorn did not come home. That was the whole story. 3 seconds, and the rest of her life. She carried the weight of it out of that building and never set it down. She wrote the letters to his wife. She stood at his grave, this cemetery, these same white stones, and rendered the honors, and folded nothing of her own grief into anything anyone could see. And then she went home to an empty apartment and discovered that the part of her that had always known how to keep going had quietly, without announcement, stopped. She healed on the outside on the schedule the doctors wanted, and did not heal anywhere it counted. And she lay in a hospital bed in the spring of 2019, with the flat, quiet certainty of a person who has decided, without drama, that she is done. Rourke came to the bed. He was a major general by then, near the end of his own service, with less power than he'd once had, and more will than any of it. He pulled every string he could still reach, and got her the one assignment nobody would have prescribed. Not a desk, not a ward. A convalescent detail at the old guard stables, back where she had started, back with the horses. "You don't quit on the difficult ones," he told her, from the chair beside the bed. "Neither do I. That's why you're getting out of that bed." There was a horse at the stables that year, a young remount named Bishop. Wild-eyed, unrideable, condemned by the schedule already, before he'd had a chance. A big black 3-year-old who trembled at his own shadow and had thrown everyone who tried him. The section had a name for horses like Bishop, and the name was not kind, and it usually came with a phone call to a farm somewhere far from Washington, where the difficult ones went to be forgotten. Ashford asked for him. The section chief thought she was joking. She was not joking. She had come to the stables a ghost of herself, a colonel select who could not sleep and would not talk, and the only thing on that whole post that made any sense to her was a frightened animal that everyone had already given up on. She worked him at 0400 hours, every morning, alone in the dark and the cold, the way she had worked a horse in the same barn 21 years before, under the same low light, with the same flat hand and the same voice pitched under the fear. She did not rush him. She did not break him. She learned his fear, and she sat with it, hour after gray hour, and she asked him for 1 inch, and then rested, and asked for 1 inch more, She was patient with him in a way she could not yet be patient with herself. And somewhere in the long, cold mornings of that winter, she could not have said the day, only that there had been one. The horse stopped shaking. And so did she. She rebuilt the horse a breath at a time. Somewhere in it, the horse rebuilt her. There is no ceremony for the day a soldier decides to live. There was only a gray morning like all the others, and a horse that met her at the stall door instead of shrinking from it, and a woman who realized, standing in the cold with her forehead against a warm black neck, that she had slept the night before, and that she wanted to see the next morning, and that the wanting had come back so quietly. She had not noticed it arrive. Rourke had known it would. That was the whole reason he had sent her there. He had not sent her to heal a horse. He had sent her to a place where healing something else might, if she was lucky and stubborn, heal her too. And he had been right, the way he had been right about her in a dark barn 21 years before. She went back to the war whole enough to fight it. Bishop stayed. He grew into the herd, into the harness, into the slow black dignity of a Caisson horse, and the years took them in different directions the way years do, until this cold October morning when a general died, and the army buried him with full honors, and the Caisson section drew the caparisoned horse for the riderless honor a general is owed. And the horse they drew, walking the empty saddle and the backward boots behind Calvin Rourke's casket, was Bishop. She had not known until she saw him step onto the route. Her breath had stopped in her chest. And no one else on that field, not Corliss, not Pratt, not the 4 stars in the official party, knew what it meant that the riderless horse behind the general's Caisson was the horse the woman in the wool coat had saved to save herself. The procession reached the graveside, and the section began to halt, and Corliss, stung by the sergeant major's rebuke, certain still that he was the only one on that field who understood order, decided to end the problem of the woman once and for all. The Caisson stopped. The caparisoned horse came level with the line where she stood. Bishop, 11 years old now, steady now, black against the white stones, drew up not 10 feet from her. Corliss moved on her, jaw tight, a man restoring his own authority in front of an audience that had watched it questioned. He had heard the sergeant major. He had heard leave her alone, and it had lodged in him like a splinter, because in 9 years no one had ever had to tell Dane Corliss to leave a civilian alone, and the telling had not made him doubt himself. It had made him surer. Pratt was going soft, that was all. Some old story about a woman in a wool coat. Corliss knew what he'd seen. He'd seen a spectator who would not hold a line, and he was going to move her the way he moved every spectator who would not hold a line, and he was going to do it now, in front of everyone, so that there could be no question afterward about who had been right. That was the shape of the mistake, not cruelty. Certainty. The absolute airless certainty of a man who has decided what you are and will not let the evidence in. That's it, he said. You're done here. Back to the visitor area now. And he reached for her arm. The boy in the clip-on tie saw it happen. He saw the sergeant's hand close on the quiet woman's arm, and in the same instant, he saw the big black horse swing his head around, ears up, nostrils working, and turn, deliberately, against every cue of the procession, toward her. The boy asked the question that the whole morning turned on. "Why is he doing that, miss?" She did not answer the sergeant. She answered the boy. She let the grip stay on her arm, did not break it, did not pull, did not resist, because she had not moved a single muscle she had not chosen to move all morning, and she was not going to start now. And for the first time since she'd stepped onto that hill, Eleanor Ashford smiled. Small. Certain. Because she had just heard Bishop's breathing change, and she knew that sound, the way she knew her own. "Because he remembers me," she said. Bishop stopped. planted. 4 feet set into the grass, head toward her, and would not walk on. Corporal Levi Prine, the caparisoned horse's handler, felt the whole animal lock up under his hand. He clucked. He asked. He gave the cues the way he'd given them 100 times on 100 routes, and the horse did not so much as flick an ear at him. 1,200 pounds of Caisson horse had broken the procession of a general's funeral and turned, on purpose, toward a woman in a wool coat that a sergeant was trying to drag off the line. Prine's face went white. A caparisoned horse does not break the route. Not this one. Not ever. And the horse would not move. Prine hauled gently, the way you haul when you cannot believe what the animal is doing. And Bishop set his weight and refused him and kept his great dark eye on the woman with the sergeant's hand still on her arm. Ashford turned her head at last. She looked at the horse, and she gave him the old command, quiet, from the barn. From 0400 hours in the winter of the worst year of her life, in a voice pitched under all the noise of the world, meant for one animal and no one else. "Easy, Bishop," she said. "I've got you." Same as before. The horse's ears came up and forward. The tremor went out of him. He steadied, but he did not leave her side. He stood against the pull of his handler and the weight of the whole ceremony, planted at her shoulder, and let out a long breath through his nose that fogged in the cold, and everything on that hillside went still. Command. Sergeant Major Orrin Pratt stepped in. He had spent 40 minutes not knowing. He knew now. He did not need the whole file. The horse had given him the last line of it. He came to her front, and he squared himself, and he rendered her a hand salute. Slow and full, and for the record, and for Corliss, and for the field. "Ma'am, Colonel," Pratt said, "the section has you. Welcome back to the route." The word moved through the cordon like a current under ice. Colonel. It passed from soldier to soldier without anyone saying it twice, the way the important things always move through a formation, not as sound, but as posture. Spines straightening down the line one after another, a wave of men coming to themselves as they understood, each in his turn, that the woman they had all watched a sergeant herd around a funeral was not what any of them had taken her for. Trask, on the cordon, felt it hit him and felt his face go hot for the second time that morning, and understood, with a strange, fierce gladness he could not have explained, that the stillness he had not been able to name had a name after all. And then the official party moved, and a man broke from it and crossed the grass, a big man in dress uniform with 4 silver stars on each shoulder. General Roland Keyes had commanded Eleanor Ashford downrange in a year the newspapers never learned about. He knew exactly who she was. He had known, the moment he'd heard the name of the woman who'd flown straight off a deployment to bury Calvin Rourke, that she would be somewhere on this hill, and it had not occurred to him in his worst imagining that she'd be behind the tape. He came to her, and he stopped, and he brought his hand up in a salute that a 4-star general owes almost no one. "Colonel Ashford," Keyes said. "He'd have wanted you on the route, not behind the tape. Take your place." Corliss's face ran the whole cycle in the space of a breath. Confusion first, the reflex of a man whose story about the world has just stopped matching the world. Then disbelief, a small shake of the head. "No, that isn't." Then recognition, cold and total, as the salutes rippled down the cordon and the word "Colonel" reached him from 3 directions at once. Then horror. His hand was still on her arm. He became aware of it the way you become aware of a thing in a nightmare, too late and all at once, and with the whole weight of consequence arriving in the same instant as the knowledge. His hand. On the arm. Of a colonel. In front of a 4-star general and the sergeant major of the regiment, and every soldier on the cordon, on the morning they buried a man she had flown across the world to mourn. He let go, as if the wool had turned to fire. He stepped back, 1 pace, 2, and his mouth opened, and nothing came out of it, and the salutes went on rippling down the line past him, courtesy after courtesy that he had no part in and could not take back the absence of. Every soldier on that hill was rendering her honors, every soldier, but the one who had spent the morning putting his hands on her. The boy in the clip-on tie watched the enormous black horse lower his head and settle his muzzle against the quiet woman's shoulder, as if the two of them were the only still point on the whole turning hill. He tugged his mother's sleeve. He had gotten his answer, and he did not yet know how good an answer it was, but he knew that the sad woman who had spoken to him kindly was somebody after all, and that the horse had known it before any of the grown-ups. The woman a sergeant had spent a morning shoving to the back of a soldier's funeral had just taken a 4-star general's salute, and the horse would not leave her side. There was no arrest. This was a funeral. But there was a reckoning, and it was quieter and worse than any arrest because it was calm. Pratt had Corliss step off the line. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The correction of a man in front of the field he tried to control does not require volume. It requires only that everyone see it, and everyone did. Corliss came to Ashford after, ash-faced, undone, a man who had discovered the size of his own mistake all at once and had nowhere to put it. "Ma'am, I didn't—" She could have ended his week with a sentence. She could have ended more than his week. She had the rank and the reason and the standing of every soul on that hill, and all she would have had to do was let the cold in her rise to her mouth. She let it stay where it was. "Render the honors, Sergeant," she said. "That's all he ever asked of any of us." "Ma'am, I didn't know." "I know," she said. "Do your job well. That's the apology I'll take." And that was the whole of his reckoning. Grace, handed to a man who had earned none, because the woman who handed it to him had been made by a man who once handed it to her on a barn floor, and she would not dishonor him on the morning of his funeral by becoming smaller than he'd raised her to be. She took her place beside the caisson. No one directed her to it. The section simply opened, the way water opens for a hull, and made the space that had always been hers, and she stepped into it. Pratt walked a half-pace behind her left shoulder, where a sergeant major walks for the people who have earned it. Corliss stood at the tape now, on the outside of the line he had guarded so jealously, and watched a colonel take the place he had spent the morning denying her, and there is no punishment a court could have handed him worse than that plain and quiet sight. She walked the last 100 meters of the route she had served as a girl, beside the horses, beside the flag, beside the man in the box who had refused to sign the paper on her. Bishop walked easy at the rear now, steadied, the empty saddle and the backward boots doing their old sad work, and the section carried Calvin Rourke down to the open ground, and the white stone and the folded flag. The volley cracked across the hill 3 times, sharp in the cold. 7 rifles, 3 times. The sound rolling out over the white stones and coming back off the far slope a half-beat late. Bishop did not flinch at it. He had heard it 100 times, and he stood the caparisoned honor the way she had taught a frightened 3-year-old to stand, steady in the noise, and she watched him do it, and felt something in her chest that was very close to pride, and very close to grief, and was, in the end, simply love. Taps came up thin and clean from a single bugle at the edge of the trees, and thinned out over the stones, until there was nothing left of it but the river and the wind. 24 notes. She had heard them for men she'd led, and men she'd lost. And now, for the man who had made all of it possible. And she stood through every one of them without moving, because that was the last gift she had to give him, and because he had taught her, on a barn floor a lifetime ago, that you do not quit on the difficult ones. Not the horses, not the soldiers, and not the long, hard business of standing still while your heart comes apart in the cold. And when it was done, Eleanor Ashford knelt at the grave and took the small, worn thing out of her glove. A cavalry spur. Hers. Old brass gone soft at the edges, carried out of the Fort Myers stables in 1998, and through everything after. 4 wars and a hospital bed and a barn full of gray mornings. She had carried that spur for 28 years. She left it with the man who had taught her to earn it. She pressed it into the cold earth at the head of the grave with 2 gloved fingers, the way you press a thing you mean to stay. And she stayed kneeling a moment longer than the ceremony asked, and no one on that hill would have dreamed of hurrying her. Whatever passed between the living colonel and the dead general in those few seconds, it did not need words, and it did not ask for witnesses, and it was the truest thing that happened on that hill all morning. Then she stood, and squared herself, and rendered the grave a last salute, slow and full and steady as a stone, and let her hand come down. If you have made it this far into her mourning, then you already know the feeling she was burying with that spur, the debt you can never repay to the one person who saw you before you were worth seeing. Subscribe to Honor Tales, and let the next story, like this one, find you when it comes. She found Specialist Milo Trask by the road, the young soldier who had shown her a kindness when it cost him nothing and gained him less. He was standing very straight and trying not to stare and failing. "You saw a person," she told him, "when everyone else saw a problem. Rourke started me on a barn floor for less than that." Trask swallowed. "Ma'am, come find me when you're ready to do more than hold a line," she said. And she gave him a card with a single number on it, the way a general had once given an angry teenager a reason to stay, and she watched the thing land in him that she knew would not stop landing for the rest of his life. At the gate, they walked Bishop out to her one last time. The big horse came to her across the gravel, unhurried, and put his gray-flecked muzzle against her shoulder and breathed her in. 7 years and 1 general stood between the woman and the horse, and none of it mattered to either of them in the slightest. She stood with him a while. She did not speak. There was nothing that needed saying between a woman and the animal she had saved to save herself, and both of them knew it, and the morning let them have it. Corporal Prine held the lead and looked studiously at the middle distance and gave them the only privacy a soldier can give, which is to pretend he is not there. Somewhere behind them, the last cars of the funeral were pulling away down the long roads between the stones. The flag was folded. The general was in the ground with a girl's cavalry spur beside him. The work of the morning was done. Her phone hummed in the wool coat. She read it once. 3 words and a place name. A coded recall. A theater with a war in it. The machinery of her real life reaching across the cemetery to remind her that the mission does not pause for grief, not even here, not even today. She squared the coat on her shoulders. She set her jaw. She kissed the horse's gray muzzle, and she went back to the war. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.